If this is your first time here, you're about to see something most people never get to see. Stay with us, subscribe, leave a comment when it's over. Tell us what you think. There is a place in Louisiana where the land remembers everything. 18,000 acres of it, flat, humid, and forgiving, surrounded on three sides by the Mississippi River, one road in, one road out. They call it the farm. Its official name is the Louisiana State Penitentiary, but nobody calls it that. Not the guards, not the wardens, not the men who have spent decades inside its perimeter. They call it Angola, named after the African country from which enslaved people were brought to work this exact land in the 19th century. The name did not change when the plantation became a prison. That decision was never formally explained. It was simply maintained. Year after year, decade after decade. Angola has held the distinction, across multiple documented periods of its history, of being called one of the most dangerous prisons in the United States of America. Not in one report, in many, filed by different investigators, across different administrations, across different decades. The pattern was consistent enough that it stopped being coincidence and became something else entirely. Something institutional, something structural, something that outlasted every reform effort sent through its front gate. This documentary is about that pattern. It is not about one crime. It is not about one warden. It is not about one error. It is about what happens when a system operates with sufficient isolation, sufficient size, and insufficient external accountability, across enough time to develop its own internal logic, its own rules, its own silence, its own economy of power. The men who lived inside that logic for years, sometimes decades, carry its evidence in ways that no official report has ever fully captured. Some agreed to speak. Not all of them. Several declined. Not out of disinterest. Out of something closer to fear. A fear that does not expire simply because you are no longer inside. That detail alone should tell you something about what Angola was. And in some documented ways, what it still is. The land itself is almost beautiful. From a distance, in certain light, it looks like farmland. Green and wide and quiet. That distance is deceptive. Up close, the razor wire catches the sun in a way that is difficult to describe. The guard towers rise at intervals along the perimeter with the confidence of things that have never been seriously challenged. The fields are still worked, every day, in Louisiana heat, by men serving sentences that range from years to lifetimes. Outsiders who have visited Angola for the first time consistently describe the same sensation, a feeling that time moves differently here, that the outside world, with its noise and speed and digital accumulation, exists in a different dimension entirely. Angola operates on its own clock. It always has. What that clock has measured, across the decades of this investigation, is the subject of everything that follows. The story begins not with a crime, not with a verdict. It begins with the land. Because the land is where the truth was always buried, and we are about to start digging. Angola did not become notorious overnight. Its reputation was built slowly, brick by brick, year by year, through incidents that were documented, then quietly filed away, through testimonies that were heard, then formally dismissed, through patterns that repeated themselves with the regularity of seasons. In the 1950s and 1960s, Angola was described by investigators as a place of extraordinary violence. Not the violence of individual crimes, the organized, institutional kind. The kind that operates within a chain of command. Congressional investigators who visited Angola during this period used language in their reports that was striking in its restraint. They described conditions that they characterized as deeply troubling, systemic, entrenched, not easily attributable to any single administrator. That last phrase matters. Not easily attributable to any single administrator. It is the language of a system protecting itself from individual accountability. It distributes responsibility so broadly that it effectively disappears. Physical labor system at Angola has been one of its most documented features and one of its most contested. Men sentenced to Angola were assigned to field work gangs, not by request, by institutional assignment. The crops varied across the decades: cotton, soybeans, corn, wheat, the same land, the same labor, a continuity that historians and civil rights advocates have documented with increasing Urgency. Former inmates who worked those fields described the experience with a consistency that is striking. The heat was the first thing. Louisiana in summer is not a metaphor for discomfort. It is a documented medical risk. Heat exhaustion, heat stroke, conditions that required medical attention that was not always promptly available. The second thing they describe is the hierarchy of the fields themselves. Who worked which rows? Who carried which tools? Who received which assignments? These were not random distributions. They followed a logic that was understood by everyone inside and rarely acknowledged by anyone outside. In 1952, a group of inmates took an action that shocked the Louisiana corrections system and briefly captured national attention. 37 men deliberately injured themselves to protest conditions at Angola. Not one, not five, 37 men, simultaneously. As a coordinated act of desperation, the incident was investigated. Reports were written. Reforms were promised. Some were implemented superficially. Others existed only on paper. Within a few years, investigators returning to Angola found conditions largely unchanged. The reports from those follow-up visits were filed, and the institutional memory of what had prompted them quietly faded. This is a pattern that repeats itself throughout Angola's documented history. Crisis, investigation, promise, silence, then the gradual return to whatever the institution had been before. Violence between inmates during Angola's most dangerous decades was documented at rates that drew repeated federal attention. The causes were complex and are still debated by criminologists. Overcrowding was a consistent factor. Understaffing was another. The concentration of individuals serving very long sentences, with limited programming and minimal incentive structures, created conditions that researchers have consistently identified as predictors of institutional violence. But there was another factor that several investigators noted, and that rarely appeared in the official summaries: the use of inmates to supervise other inmates. Angola employed a system common to southern prison farms of the era, in which trusted long-term prisoners were given authority over their fellow inmates. Armed authority. In some documented cases, this system created a secondary power structure operating beneath official oversight, one that was efficient from an administrative standpoint, one that was deeply dangerous from a human rights standpoint. Federal courts eventually took notice. In a series of rulings across the 1970s, Angola was found to have operated under conditions that violated the constitutional prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. The rulings were significant. The implementation of court-ordered reforms was slow, contested, and incomplete, in ways that multiple follow-up investigations documented clearly. One federal judge overseeing Angola reforms reportedly expressed frustration at the pace of institutional change in language that was unusually direct for judicial proceedings. The court record from that period is available to researchers. What it reveals about the gap between ordered reform and actual practice is a story in itself, a story that Angola's administrators at various points characterized very differently than the court-appointed monitors did. Two versions of the same institution, existing simultaneously, one on paper, one in practice. That gap between the documented version of Angola and the lived version is where this investigation has consistently found its most important evidence. There is a language spoken at Angola that has no official dictionary. It is not taught in orientation. It is not written in any policy manual. It is transmitted through proximity, through observation, through the slow understanding of what happens to people who speak outside of it. Former inmates call it different things. The code, the understanding, the way things work. The vocabulary changes. The meaning never does. It means what happens here stays here, not as a cultural preference, as a survival requirement. Men who filed formal complaints about conditions at Angola during its most documented dangerous periods describe remarkably consistent outcomes. The complaint would be received. An acknowledgement would sometimes follow. Then silence. Then, in several documented cases, something more concerning than silence: a transfer to a different housing unit, a change in work assignment, a shift in the daily texture of life that communicated something clearly without ever stating it explicitly. This is not presented here as universal experience. Angola housed thousands of men across many decades. Not every complaint disappeared. Not every voice was silenced. But the pattern appears across enough independent testimonies, across enough separate documented incidents, to constitute something beyond coincidence. Correctional officers who worked at Angola during various periods tell their own version of this story. Several former officers, speaking in various journalistic investigations conducted over the decades, described a workplace culture that discouraged internal dissent with the same efficiency it discouraged inmate complaint. An officer who reported misconduct by a fellow officer entered a different kind of institutional experience. Shift assignments changed. Backup arrived more slowly. The informal networks that make institutional work survivable quietly contracted. The message was structural, not verbal. It did not require anyone to say anything directly. It communicated through the mechanics of daily institutional life. This dual silence, enforced simultaneously on inmates and officers, created an environment in which the official record and the lived reality could diverge substantially without that divergence ever fully surfacing. Investigative journalists who covered Angola across the decades describe the difficulty of sourcing as unlike anything they encountered in other institutional investigations. People who had left Angola, who were no longer subject to its daily authority, who had every structural reason to speak freely, often declined. Not all of them. Some spoke at length, and what they described formed the foundation of multiple serious investigations, but the reluctance itself was data. The silence around Angola was not the silence of nothing happening. It was the silence of people who had learned, through direct experience, what speaking cost. The prison rodeo is perhaps Angola's most internationally recognized feature. Running since 1965, open to the public, a spectacle that draws thousands of visitors annually to the grounds of a maximum security prison. Critics of the rodeo have raised documented concerns about the nature of inmate participation and the risk calculus involved. Supporters argue it provides programming, income opportunity, and connection to the outside world for men who have very little of either. Both arguments contain documented truth. The tension between them has never been fully resolved. What the rodeo undeniably represents is Angola's complicated relationship with its own visibility. On rodeo weekends, the outside world enters Angola. Cameras are present, families attend. The institution presents a version of itself that is carefully managed and widely photographed. That version exists. It is real in its own way, but it coexists with the version that does not appear on rodeo weekends. The version that operates on ordinary Tuesdays in August, when the cameras are absent, when the fields are being worked in heat that exceeds 100 degrees, when the grievance forms are moving through their slow institutional journey toward outcomes that may never arrive. Federal oversight of Angola has been a recurring feature of its modern history. Consent decrees, court monitors, mandated reform timelines, each representing an external acknowledgement that the internal accountability mechanisms were insufficient to the task. And yet the oversight itself has had a complicated history. Court monitors reported progress. Subsequent investigations sometimes found that the progress was less complete than the official reporting suggested. New consent decrees followed old ones. The cycle repeated. Each cycle generated documentation. Reports filed with federal courts. Responses filed by the state. Counter-responses. Appeals. Paper record of institutional negotiation that stretches across decades and fills multiple filing systems. Somewhere inside that paper record is the distance between what Angola told the courts it was doing and what was actually happening inside its 18,000 acres. That distance has never been fully and finally measured. Which brings us to the question this investigation has been quietly building toward. If the silence was this complete, if the paper record diverged this consistently from documented testimony, if external oversight cycled through the same patterns repeatedly without achieving permanent change, then what else was happening inside Angola that never reached any record at all? What exists in the gap between the documented and the disappeared? The answer to that question is what several people agreed to tell us. And what they described changed the direction of this entire investigation. When people finally speak, after years of not speaking, they do not always begin at the beginning. They begin at the edges. The details that feel safer. The peripheral memories that circle the center without immediately touching it. And then, slowly, the scent arrives anyway. The testimonies gathered for this investigation came from multiple sources: former inmates, former officers, family members of both, advocates who worked Angola cases across different decades. No single testimony was treated as definitive. Each was cross-referenced against available documentation, against court records, against the accounts of others who had no contact with the original source. Where testimonies converged, that convergence was noted. Where they diverged, that divergence was noted equally. What follows is what the evidence, taken in its totality, most consistently describes. The trustee system at Angola was perhaps the single most documented source of institutional concern across the prison's modern history. Trustees, or trustees as they were called, were long-term inmates granted elevated status and specific authority within the prison hierarchy. In some documented periods, this authority included the carrying of weapons. The logic, from an administrative standpoint, was efficiency. Angola is vast. Staffing it adequately with paid correctional personnel was consistently identified in budget documents as a financial challenge. The trustee system solved that problem at minimal cost. What it created instead was a secondary power structure operating within the prison with limited external oversight. Former inmates describe a world within the world of Angola, one in which the official rules existed alongside an unofficial hierarchy that could override them in the spaces between official observation: who received which work assignment, who was housed in which dormitory, who faced which consequences for which infractions. These decisions nominally belonged to correctional staff. In practice, according to multiple testimonies, they were frequently negotiated through the trustee hierarchy. Man, who arrived at Angola in the early 1970s, described his first weeks in terms of learning to separate maps of the institution. The official map, communicated through intake procedures, explained how Angola formally operated. The real map, communicated through observation and the quiet council of longer-serving inmates, explained how Angola actually operated. He said the distance between those two maps was the most important thing a new arrival needed to understand. Getting that distance wrong had consequences. In some documented cases, serious consequences. The medical system at Angola during its most scrutinized periods generated some of the most troubling documented evidence in the prison's history. Federal investigators examining Angola across multiple decades found medical care that was, and their formal language, constitutionally deficient. Behind that formal language were specific documented cases: men who reported symptoms and waited weeks for evaluation, men who developed conditions that advanced beyond treatment during the waiting period, men who died inside Angola from causes that independent medical reviewers subsequently questioned. Not in one case, in a documented pattern that was serious enough to trigger federal intervention on multiple separate occasions. Each intervention produced mandated reforms. Each set of mandated reforms produced official compliance reporting, and each subsequent investigation found the situation less resolved than the compliance report had suggested. The death records at Angola across its most documented dangerous decades tell their own story. Angola has its own cemetery. It is called Point Lookout. It sits on the prison grounds. It holds the remains of inmates who died inside Angola and whose bodies were unclaimed by family or whose families could not afford alternative arrangements. The graves are marked with simple numbered metal crosses, not names, numbers. Researchers and advocates who have studied Point Lookout have documented the accumulation of those crosses across the decades as evidence of something that the official mortality statistics did not always fully illuminate: who these men were, how they died, whether their deaths were fully and independently investigated. These questions have not always received satisfying answers from the official record. One advocate who spent years researching deaths at Angola described sitting at the fence line of Point Lookout and trying to match the numbered crosses to the names and death records obtained through public records requests. The matching process, she said, revealed gaps. Not every cross corresponded to a complete and transparent record. Not every death told a fully documented story. She described that experience as one of the most professionally and personally disturbing of her career. Former inmates who witnessed deaths inside Angola during various periods describe a processing of those events that reflected the broader institutional culture. A man died. The institutional machinery responded. Forms were completed. Bodies were moved. The dormitory continued its routine. The fields were worked the next morning. The grief, when it existed, was private and unacknowledged. Because grief, like complaint, was not something the institution had a formal mechanism for receiving. It simply continued, indifferent to individual loss in the way that large institutions become indifferent when they operate without sufficient accountability to the humanity inside them. This is the Angola that the official record only partially captures, the one documented in testimonies, in cross-referenced accounts, in the numbered crosses of Point Lookout that accumulate quietly at the edge of 18,000 acres of Louisiana farmland, and still, according to the people who agreed to speak for this investigation, there are things that even this evidence does not fully reach, things that happened in the spaces between documentation, in the hours between counts, in the geography of a prison large enough to absorb what it wanted to absorb. Those things are coming next. Leaving Angola is not always a matter of serving your time. For some men, leaving became an obsession that consumed decades. For others, it became something they quietly stopped believing in. And for a documented few, leaving meant something the institution never officially acknowledged. This chapter is about the ones who tried. Legal mechanisms available to Angola inmates seeking relief from their sentences have changed substantially across the prison's history. In earlier decades, options were limited, poorly understood, and practically inaccessible to men who arrived with minimal education and no legal representation. The right to appeal existed on paper. Its exercise required resources that most Angola inmates simply did not have. This is not a minor administrative detail. It is a structural feature of the system that determined, in practical terms, who could challenge their confinement and who could not. Men with families who could afford outside attorneys navigated a different Angola than men without them. The institution was the same. The sentence was often the same. The practical experience of seeking relief was entirely different. Some men taught themselves law. Across years of careful study in Angola's law library, men who had arrived functionally illiterate became sophisticated legal researchers. Their work was not always successful. The procedural barriers to post-conviction relief are formidable under any circumstances. For self-represented inmates navigating complex federal standards without legal training, the margin for error was essentially zero. A single procedural misstep could permanently close an avenue of appeal. No second chance. No correction. The door closed and did not reopen. And yet men kept filing, year after year, rejection after rejection, because the alternative was to accept a permanence that something inside them refused to accommodate. Several men who spent significant portions of their sentences in legal self-study at Angola eventually produced arguments that attracted the attention of outside legal advocates. Their cases became part of a broader legal movement examining conditions at Angola and the constitutional adequacy of Louisiana's corrections system. Some of those cases produced results, slowly and perfectly, over timelines measured in years rather than months, but results for every man whose legal work eventually reached a sympathetic court. There were many others whose petitions moved through the system and returned with denials that offered minimal explanation. The disparity between those outcomes was not always explained by the relative merits of the cases. It was sometimes explained by excess, by which cases attracted pro bono legal support, by which stories became visible enough to generate outside advocacy. Angola's size and isolation worked against visibility. A prison that is genuinely difficult to reach geographically and institutionally does not generate the same journalistic and advocacy attention as facilities closer to population centers and media markets. That isolation was not accidental. Angola's location, surrounded on 3 sides by the river, accessible by one road, was a feature of its design as a total institution. It kept things in. It also kept scrutiny out. Escapes from Angola across its history were documented but relatively rare. The geography made traditional escape extraordinarily difficult. The river was not a boundary easily crossed, but men tried. The documented escape attempts from Angola across its history speak to something beyond mere desire for freedom. They speak to a desperation specific to long-term confinement in conditions that were, across multiple documented periods, found to be constitutionally deficient. Men do not risk the serious additional consequences of an escape attempt unless what they are escaping from feels more urgent than what they are escaping toward. Hat calculation, made by men in various documented periods of Angola's history, is itself a form of testimony about conditions inside family. Members of Angola inmates describe the particular experience of loving someone inside a place so geographically and institutionally remote, the visits required, the cost of travel, the hours of driving on that single access road, the security procedures at the entrance, the time-limited visits in rooms that were not designed for human connection, and then the drive back, leaving someone behind in a place that felt, to many families, less like a correctional institution and more like a geographic erasure. Their loved one had not simply been sentenced and imprisoned. He had been placed somewhere specifically designed to make his continued existence as invisible as possible to the world outside. One mother who made that drive regularly for more than 15 years described the moment she would lose sight of the prison in her rearview mirror. She said it never got easier. Not the first time. Not the 100th, because the thing she couldn't shake, no matter how many times she made it, was the awareness that he was still there, behind her, getting smaller, until the road curved and Angola disappeared entirely, and the world outside continued as though the 18,000 acres behind her did not exist at all. That invisibility, enforced by geography and institution alike, is what this investigation has spent 5 chapters examining, what it enabled, what it protected, what it buried. The final chapter of this investigation does not offer clean resolution, because Angola's story does not have one. What it offers instead is the evidence as it stands, the testimonies as they were given, the records as they were found, and the questions that remain, as of this investigation, without fully satisfying answers. That incompleteness is itself part of the story. Every investigation arrives at a moment of accounting. Not the clean resolution that justice demands and reality rarely delivers, but the moment where the evidence, laid end to end, demands a response from anyone willing to look at it honestly. That moment is now. Angola still exists. It is operating today. The 18,000 acres are still there. The single road still leads in one direction and out the other. The fields are still worked. The guard towers still stand. The numbered crosses at Point Lookout continue their quiet accumulation at the edge of the property. Some things have changed. That must be stated honestly. Reforms implemented across the last several decades have altered specific documented practices. The trustee system, in its most dangerous historical form, was formally abolished following federal court intervention. Medical care has been the subject of ongoing mandated improvement under successive consent decrees. Educational and religious programming has expanded substantially from what existed in earlier decades. Current Angola administrators have, in various public statements, described a fundamentally different institution from the one documented in the federal investigations of earlier eras. Those statements deserve to be taken seriously. Institutions can change. People inside them can change. The documented record of Angola's recent decades is genuinely more complex than its earlier history, but complexity is not resolution. The consent decrees that drove the most significant reforms at Angola were the product of litigation, of external pressure, of federal courts finding that the institution could not adequately reform itself without mandated external accountability. The question of what Angola looks like when that external pressure is absent is not a hypothetical one. It is answered by the historical record. And the historical record suggests that the relationship between Angola's internal culture and genuine accountability has always been more complicated than official reporting preferred to acknowledge. There are men inside Angola today who entered as teenagers, who have been inside longer than many of their current guards have been alive, who learned everything they know about adult life inside an institution that has been found, across multiple formal investigations, to have operated in ways that violated their constitutional rights. What is owed to those men is a question that Louisiana's legal and political system has answered inconsistently across different administrations and different eras. The Supreme Court rulings of the Last 2 decades have created new legal pathways for some of them. Resentencing hearings, parole eligibility reviews, formal reconsideration of sentences imposed before those rulings existed. Some men have walked out of Angola as a result, after decades inside, into a world they do not recognize, carrying decades of institutional experience in bodies that have aged entirely within those 18,000 acres. Their re-entry into the world is its own investigation, one that this documentary does not have the space to fully examine. But it is worth noting that the men who leave Angola after very long sentences do not leave clean. They leave carrying Angola with them, in ways that are psychological, in ways that are physical, in the specific texture of how they move through a world that continued without them for decades. One man released from Angola after 32 years described standing in a grocery store for the first time. He stood in front of a display of breakfast cereals for an extended period, unable to choose, not because the choices were difficult, because the experience of choosing had been removed from his life so completely, for so long, that its sudden return was genuinely disorienting. He described that moment not with anger, with a kind of quiet bewilderment that was harder to hear than anger, because it communicated something that no court document, no federal investigation, no consent decree had ever quite managed to capture: what decades inside Angola actually did to a person, not the documented constitutional violations, not the systemic failures of medical care and oversight. The thing underneath all of that, the erosion of ordinary human capacity that happens so gradually, across so many accumulated days, that neither the institution nor the person inside it fully tracks its progress, until a man stands in a grocery store unable to choose a cereal, and understands in that moment the full cost of what was taken from him. Angola will continue to exist. The land will continue to hold what it has always held. The Mississippi will continue to define its borders on 3 sides. The numbered crosses at Point Lookout will continue to stand in their quiet rows. And the questions this investigation has raised about accountability, about visibility, about what we permit to happen in places we have decided not to look at too carefully, those questions will continue to wait for answers that the official record has not yet provided. This investigation does not end with those answers. It ends with the questions standing in plain sight, because the first step toward accountability is always the same. Someone has to be willing to look. This documentary was one attempt at looking. If it made you see something you had not seen before, share it with someone who needs to see it too. Every view, every conversation it starts, every person who finishes watching and carries these questions forward into their own life, that is how buried stories find the light they deserve. We will keep investigating. We will keep looking at the places designed to avoid being looked at. Stay with us for the next one. The story never really ends. It just moves to a different chapter.